So in this fourth and final video of the Beat the London series, we are going to have a look at the main line after 9 bishop to g3. And it's also one of the most common moves that is played in this particular gambit variation. So without further ado, let's get into it. So here I'm going to go to the critical position really quickly. If you have any issues about what can white do before this, you have to look at the other videos in the series, which is Beat the London 1, 2, and 3. Here, after giving up the pawn-sac, we give up the bishop, and now after g5, in the previous video, we have looked at bishop takes g5, which is also the strongest move, but also not the most commonly played move. The most commonly played move is the topic of this video, which is bishop to g3. Now, white already smells something funny is going on, and that we have certainly prepared this line. And after g5, they basically decline the pawn sacrifice and just play bishop g3, which also has the merit of protecting the pawn on e5. Here, black plays h5. Now, the idea is pretty simple. We want to go h4 and trap the bishop. Here, white has played essentially two moves here. One of them is h3 and the other one is h4. And in equal amounts of frequency. So h3 and h4 are both played quite often. The slightly more often played move is h4. But first we'll look at, let's say, h3. h3 essentially gives the bishop a square. And over here we play bishop to g7. Now the e5 pawn is basically doomed. And there is nothing that they can do to prevent that pawn from hanging. So instead they focus on development. Knight f3 is a really common move. Now, knight f3 has the merit of not only protecting this particular pawn for the time being, but also counterattacking our own pawn on g5. From here, we essentially want to play this move g4. Now, I'll tell you, I'm not recommending that you play the move g4, but I'm going to tell you what black is kind of aiming for. After g4, black is aiming for this position after h, rook takes, bishop takes, knight d4, and now knight g to e7. This is the kind of piece constellation that we are looking for. The knight on e7, the knight on c6, the bishop on f5, still putting pressure on the e5 pawn. But I don't really like the position of this bishop. I would rather want this bishop to be on g7 and have this rook be on h8. This is the only problem with this piece constellation right now. If that was the case, black will have a pretty fine position here. That's why the idea of immediately g4, although it has scored well in practice, isn't really the best. So what do I recommend instead of g4 after knight f3? My recommendation is that we simply castle. And over here, the lines can get quite tactical, so pay special attention to them. Now here, let's look at a few moves, but let's look at the most critical one first, which is what if they simply grab our g5 pawn. Now they're also threatening another fork on f7, which will fork both the rooks. So what do we do here? Well, we basically capture their particular pawn. And here is the important intermezzo. If you mistakenly capture the pawn with the knight, then after bishop takes and knight takes f7, black doesn't really have enough compensation. So you have to take care into account that this is not something that you're falling into. And the reason why black doesn't have enough compensation is because the white king hasn't really been exposed. But you'll see in the other line that the white king gets really exposed in those lines. So instead of knight takes e5, what we should do is actually bishop takes e5. And now, obviously, if bishop takes e5, we take back with the knight and we are protecting our pawn. So there's no knight f7. Forgive me. So there's no knight f7 here. And they can start playing moves like bishop e2, but that's already a mistake. You know, imagine they are only playing natural moves and now this is already lost. After queen g6, we have some serious pressure on the g file. And when I say lost, I mean it's actually lost. Stockfish will say something like -2 or -3 in the favor of black. So let's look at a game that went in this particular direction and it doesn't end really well for white. After f4, they are counterattacking our knight while also protecting their own knight. Here we go, knight d3 check, bishop d3, and now you have this annoying pressure on g2 and f6 might come next. So the white player played king f2 here. And over here, there is a fantastic move, which is knight h6. Now, the purpose of this particular move, knight h6, is to actually reroute the knight in several cases to f5, putting more pressure on e3, or sometimes even bring it to g4, which opens up the h file in favorable circumstances. So after knight h6, let's look at how that particular game went. It's knight d2, f6, we push the knight back, knight gf3, rook at g8, threatening something nasty on g2. And obviously now you should know that you can't play rook g1 because queen g3 is actually mate. So protecting it via h2 might be a better option. And here comes knight f5. And obviously in any particular situation, whenever you close the g1 escape route, we always have this particular mate here. So this is something that you can't really do. So after knight f5, the game went b3, and here comes a long sequence where we're just putting more pressure on this particular pawn. Then we finally sack our particular rook for it. Okay, they think they can get 2 pieces for it, but in reality it's really horrible. The game actually finished in a pretty sad fashion with knight e1 trying to protect g2, queen takes f4, knight takes d3, pawn takes d3, king h1, and here came the knight sacrifice, knight takes g2. And after rook g2, queen d2, and queen takes d2, it's all over. So this is the kind of madness that can happen if they just play a innocent looking move, which was bishop to e2. Another move that they can play in this position is knight to d2, which is also pretty innocent. But after knight d3, bishop d3, and now they can take on f7 because it looks like it's good. They can also play h4, but knight f7 has been played the most often. So after knight takes f7, we have, what do? Do we protect this rook? Do we protect this rook? Well, we simply play rook e8. And the reason is we are having some nasty sacrifices here. And after, let's say, something like knight takes h8, we have rook takes e3, f takes e3, and that would just be mate. And let's say after the rook sack, they decide to move the king with king d1. The position is actually very dangerous for white. White cannot really castle. This particular pawn, this particular knight, and this particular queen is preventing white from reaching the safety of the queenside also. And this particular knight is dead now. And we can simply keep increasing the pressure. One particular finish could be rook e2, rook f1, knight f6, knight f7, rook takes f2. Now, rook to e1 might be the best move here, but it's all pretty lost. So even something like rook f2, queen f2, I don't really think you can prevent queen to e2 mate. So this is the kind of thing that can happen on just playing natural moves in this position. So let's say they don't play bishop e2 or something like that, and they don't even take our pawn back with bishop takes. But let's say after bishop takes e5, they immediately decide to go and capture the f7 pawn, fork our rooks. Here is the thing that I was talking about, is that we open up the king side. Bishop takes g3. And over here, 3 moves can be played. Let's look at the worst one first, let's say. So knight takes h8. After knight takes h8, we go rook e8, similar to the other line, because we want to sack something over here. And now white couldn't resist the greed of f takes g3. And over here comes rook e3, king d1, knight f6, knight to d2, just trying to get the pieces developed and try to come out. Knight e5, bishop e2, and now we are threatening d4. And this is a very bad position for white. Engines confirm the evaluation. And let's just look at one of the pretty finishes that I found in the database. Knight d3, bishop d3, knight f7, trying to wriggle the knight back out. King e2, knight g5, rook takes g2, and now we are entering with queen f2 here. They probably have to give up the rook with something like rook f1 and then bishop takes f1. But the game continues with knight gf3, and over here is a fantastic move, brilliant move. We can play queen to f2 here, but here comes another fantastic sacrifice, which is knight g4. Now knight g4, on the looks of it, threatens these two forks with knight f2 check and also knight to d3 check. But the crazy and the stunning point is actually it frees up the g7 square for the queen, which is just quite amazing. And you can see this effect in the variation where they accept sacrifice. We give a check. Obviously, moving the king here would result in mate. So you can't go here. You have to come here, and then this particular check, queen g7, queen g6 check. And you have to sack the knight and basically get mated with bishop f3. So this is the kind of fun that white is in for. So over here, that's what happened after knight takes h8. What about knight takes d8, taking the other rook? Still, we don't have a rook to place on e8 now because of the knight. So we go with the other attacking plan, which is knight e5. And after knight e5, let's say they capture the free material again, knight f6. And the plan is pretty simple. The white king side is actually broken up. The f file is now open for our rook, so the rook can come here. The f6 knight generally has plans to go to e4 and pressure the g3 pawn. The knight on e5, 90% of the time will actually come here to d3 and sack itself. Not sack, actually get itself exchanged for this bishop, and then our bishop over here sits on this fantastic diagonal which prevents castling. That is one particular plan here. Let's look at how one of the games developed, and you can see how quickly things can go wrong. Bishop e2, okay, we check because they were basically planning to castle the next move, so we give this check. Bishop takes, now they can no longer castle. Knight f7, trying to do some shenanigans with the knight. Rook e8, right? That's exactly where we want our rook to be, unless we have a specific reason to put it on f8 or any other square. King f2, trying to prevent something, but knight e4 check. And obviously you understand, after king g1, knight takes g3, it's all game over. The funny finish of the game was actually king f3 and queen f6 checkmate. So a pretty checkmate in the kind of the middle of the board. So that is something after knight takes d8. But the most common move here is simply f takes g3. They have taken our bishop and they're still forking the rooks. The rooks are not going anywhere. The rooks cannot protect themselves. So this seems like the most logical move. But over here, we play this move, rook to f8. Now, rook f8 is pretty deadly. Knight takes h8 is the most common continuation, and now we just keep rolling forward with knight e5. Bishop e2 was their plan. They want to castle next move, so we give this check. And now here is the idea. The knight over here on g8 wants to go to f6 and e4 and then try to pressure this particular pawn on g3. The queen wants to come to c7 and then also put pressure here. The rook is very deadly on this particular open file. This actually also prevents the other rook from coming to f1. So it's a very deadly position for white. And this particular knight here, I don't really think that it's going anywhere. So let's say they try to sack back the knight, trying to do something. Queen takes g6, knight d2, queen takes g3 check, king d1, queen takes g2, and over here it was just a massacre. And I'm actually following a game which white won, which is very surprising. So this entire sequence with knight g6 was actually played in a real game. So over here, black is playing fantastic moves, just playing one good move after the other, and it's already forced mate by this point. And the way white managed to lose this game is just by playing some inaccuracies and not being able to see some tactical shots. But if you know that these shots exist, you'll be able to find them. Bishop b takes c4. over here, knight e4 is the best move, but d takes e4 also doesn't spoil much. Rook b1, and now rook f1 is the fantastic shot, which he did not find. But even then, knight e4 is also pretty good enough, which was played in the game. And here is where black started to lose the thread of it. So after rook b2, they played rook f6. And after rook f6 is already pretty desperate now, because after knight takes e4, they have to play the only move, which is queen f3. And they did not manage to find queen f3, and white was able to wriggle out and they were able to win. But how it can finish is after queen f3, rook b2, bishop takes, rook takes, queen e4. And now we have two threats. One is simply going rook f1 check, and the other one is actually to bring the rook to the queen side with rook b6, rook b1. And this seems like a pretty lost position. So you can see the kind of damage that white can endure if he takes the pawn on 5 and finally takes the pawn on f7. So this is something that they cannot really do. So if they can't go knight takes g5, what else have they tried? Well, they have tried a few things. They have tried bishop e2, which seems logical, but here we play g4. That was our plan. And after, let's say, knight d4, this is a common theme. Whenever the knight comes to d4 trying to threaten our particular bishop, we play knight g to e7 and protect it. Like I said, this particular piece constellation is very common. So the two knights on e7 and c6 and the two bishops on f5 and g7. This is the way we play in this particular gambit line. And the rooks already being on one of the rook already being on h8 is a fantastic sign to play this g4 move. So after knight to d4, we play knight g7, and we have similar ideas to how we look at in the other lines. But let's say they go and they simply take the pawn. Cool, we take it back. They take. And now here is where I've seen a few black players go wrong. What they actually do is they blindly capture the rook, and after knight d4 they play knight g7, and after knight f5 and bishop g4, they realize something is different in this position. And the reason for this difference is that the rook is not there on h8. That was the whole plan, to play castles first, right? This rook is not here on h8, so there's no pressure on this particular file. There's no check winning the queen. Our own knight is now pinned, and we'll have to make some regressive moves to prevent loss of material. Something like knight c7, queen c2, adding more pressure, queen c6, bishop h3. Now we've seen that they've also managed to plug the edge file, and now they simply plan to go knight d2 and castle. And this is not the position that black wants. In fact, I believe black is simply lost in this particular position. So here is a key thing that you must notice. So in this bishop e2 lines, where we play g4 and they capture back, when they capture the rook, we have this fantastic intermezzo, which reminds me of a game Tal played, which is g takes f3. Now we are threatening the rook with the, we are threatening the rook, we are threatening the pawn and the bishop, and that seems to be a pretty solid position. Let's look at it concretely. The most common move is rook takes g8. After this, the lines, it's almost like a fourth sequence, let's say. Rook takes g8, gf3, and bishop takes e5. And over here, we can see that our rook has amazing open lines to work with. The bishop is fantastic on this diagonal. The b2 pawn is always weak. So whenever the queen moves and loses support of the b2 pawn, our own queen can come in and then start attacking from the other side of the board. Let's look at a game which concluded in a pretty quick manner. Knight d2, bishop takes, and now we already have the open file. King f2, rook h3, queen g1, and let's take the pawn. So the queen has left the protection and we immediately take the pawn. Rook d1, queen takes c3, and now we don't have to go further, but let's just say for the sake of completion, we try to finish the game. Queen g8 check, knight d8, which is important. We don't want to give up anything unless we really have to. Queen g5, rook h2 check, king e1, bishop d3, bishop f1, bishop takes, king takes, and queen d3. And the conclusion of the game was king g1 and rook takes d2. So you can see the kind of amazing attack that black has developed in this particular line. And so to avoid all of this, it's quite important that they deviate. A really tricky way for them to deviate is to play rook h5. Now rook h5 moves the rook away from being attacked by the bishop and now counterattacks our own bishop. Here, if we simply, let's say, capture the bishop, I don't really think this is a good position. But here we have this move, which is f takes g2. Now we are threatening to simply queen. The rook can't go back because we queen by taking the rook. So the only move in this position is bishop h2. Now bishop h2, we play bishop takes e5. Now the reason is if they blindly capture our rook, we capture the bishop, and now we are threatening to queen again. If they come back, they have to forcefully give up their rook, and now we are simply a piece up, and the white king is also pretty misplaced. It will take him a lot of moves to get castled, and black will drum up a good attack in that particular position. So instead of taking the bishop, they can go with bishop g1. And now it looks like they simply are up in exchange. They have a rook for a knight, and it seems everything is rosy, but that's not the case. Knight g7 is what we can play. And after, let's say, a common move or like knight d2, bishop c7. Now, I cannot simply recommend you to play bishop c7 without telling you what's the idea behind it. Now, the thing is, we would like to move the bishop to, let's say, here, and we don't really want the white rook to sack itself for the bishop, because the bishop is very important and it might be needed to lure away the other bishop so that our own pawn can promote. So bishop c7 is a good way to essentially keep the bishop. Also, it's better than bishop b8 because from here at least it can come to this diagonal and threaten something on the queen side as well. So bishop c7 is what we want to play. Knight f3, and we go bishop e4. We wanted to move the bishop, so we can also go to g6, but e4 seems slightly more active. Queen d2, king b8. Now, what's the move? What's the reason for king b8? Now, the king b8 wants to get away from these diagonals and any particular tricks on this particular diagonal. Now, it seems like black is maneuvering his pieces here and there and not really attacking. But you see, white can't really do anything. This pawn is a huge thorn. It cannot be neutralized immediately. And castling queenside is also not without its drawback, because this particular bishop is so strong that it's going to always cause some problems. So let's say they castle queenside. We have queen a5, a3, queen a4, and now a disastrous move that was played by white was knight to e1. Now knight to e1, they want to either play f3 or bishop f3 to kick this particular bishop out and then get to this particular pawn. But after knight f5, it's all over. So we are threatening this deadly check, forking the king and the queen. And you can see that this particular pawn here, despite being there for like, I don't know, 10 moves or so, white hasn't been able to capture this pawn. And it was this pawn that has actually caused so much disharmony in the white position. So this is something that white can fall into in this particular g4 line after they play bishop e2. But let's say they play another move, which is very common, which is also just trying to get the knight out first. Here, we simply go forward with our piece constellation. Like I told you, this is the setup that we want. This is the setup that we want. And let's say now they play bishop e2. Cool. The same. g4. But over here, at least, when they take back, we can actually take back with the rook. Now, the difference between this rook capture and the other rook capture, which I can show you after bishop to e2 directly. over here, this rook capture was taken with a bishop and not with the rook, and this is not really recommended, right? So this was the reason why playing knight to e7 has allowed us to take capture back with the rook, and that has made a lot of difference. So after castle, we were on the variation knight b to d2, and now we have played this. Obviously, if they capture the pawn on g5, we capture here, and we have similar play to the other line, where if they capture on f7, we capture on g3, and then they have these 3 captures again. So it's quite similar play to that particular line. Let's say after knight g7, they play bishop e2, and now g4. Takes, and now knight d4, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and simply knight c6. Now the idea is knight c6 is sometimes to sack our knight here, but also sometimes the knight can come here and then hop on to d3. It's similar to the other variation where the knight was on e5 and hopping to d3. Now it can go to b4 and hop on to d3. Queen c7, bishop f8. Now bishop f8 is a very strong retreating move. We are threatening things like this, and to prevent that, they can play a3. And after check, let's say the knight moves back, queen a6 is actually a very cunning move. White players don't really realize that the rook is now pinned, the pawn is now pinned to the rook, and sometimes they play this disastrous move, which is king d2, and after bishop f4, bishop b4, they have to lose the rook. So this is also not that happy. So we have looked at knight d2, we have looked at knight takes g5, we have looked at we've looked at bishop e2. Now let's look at the final move, which is quite direct also, which is simply knight d4. After knight d4, again knight g7. We have this piece constellation again, and if they take, we take. We have already seen this particular variation. And after bishop h2, let's say, we take back the pawn. After all the captures, they can play knight here. And here is something where you should pause. Now, compared to the other variations where the bishop survives on g3 or h2 or something like that, there is nothing here. And the white king is several moves away from castling either side. They can't castle kingside or queenside right now. And the move knight to d2 has actually blocked the queen's vision of the e3 pawn. And now over here, there are several good moves that you can play, but I recommend that you simply sack the knight. After knight e3, f e3, queen e3, and king d1. Yeah, bishop e2 doesn't really make sense because you lose the queen. So king d1, and now d4. And this position is just absolutely devastating for white. The d file is about to open up and there's a lot of pressure. So this is completely winning for black. There are several tactics there, but you'll be able to figure them out if you know about these particular tactics. So I hope that you investigate this line yourself in further detail. So this was the entire complex of what happens after they play knight f3 and we castle, and we have looked at all the moves here. We have looked at, let's say, knight g5, we have looked at bishop e2, we have looked at knight d2, we also looked at knight d4 here. So this concludes our coverage of this particular move order when they play knight f3 and we castle. And this is the h3 move. But what happens after they play h4? So after h4, there are a few moves that you can play. You can also play g takes h4, but I recommend that you play g4. Now g4 prevents the knight from coming to its most obvious square, so it will have to reroute itself through e2. And after bishop g7, we see again that the pawn is lost. And you can probably guess what we do after the most common move, knight d4, right? So you can, if you want to drop the bishop back, there's no problem with this. But what do we want to achieve? this peace constellation. And I'm pretty sure you are bored of me saying the word peace constellation by this moment, but saying the same thing again and again just helps you reinforce uh, that particular knowledge. So knight g7, knight d2, well, they have to develop something. And now we play bishop takes e5. How long can we wait the allure to simply capture back the pawn? And now we're not material down or anything, so we have simply captured the pawn back. Bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, and now the most common move, which is knight takes f5, because white is quite cramped for space, and the more exchanges that it does, the better it will feel. And it feels like after knight takes f5, queen c2, it seems like white is simply going to castle now and have a decent game. Yeah, but queen f6 is quite a strong move here. Now queen f6 threatens the particular pawn on h4, and we are also threatening this other plan of simply castling and, let's say, going up the board, or sometimes not castling and just playing rook here and going up the board with b4, b5, b4. Sometimes we can play b5 and b4 as a sacrifice. So there are lots of good moves. Another thing to remember is if they ever check us over here on a4, we have this plan of simply going f8 and g7. So that's another way to get the king to safety and connect the rooks, right? So after, let's say, queen a4, we can go, they can play g3 trying to protect the pawn. We simply go king g7, and now we have these two beautiful open, not open, I mean semi-open files that we can try to attack down with, right? So after something like bishop e2, rook h e8, castle, rook a b8, I really like this position because black has a simple plan. They want to play b4, b5 and try to rip open the queenside. And over here, I don't really see a lot of counterplay. And even if some counterplay develops with f3, let's say, right now it's not possible. But even if it develops, I think black's counterplay will be faster. And we should not forget this weakness on d3 here, because even if it's ever captured, the knight landing there, the pawn that takes its place is also quite a menace. So that was the queen a4 line. But after queen f6, they might as well also just go castle. And I also really like this position after castles for black, because we have that straightforward plan again. We can still play this, but also the plans that I just mentioned also gain in popularity. Now here you can go complete psycho style and go kingside castle and then just try to ramp all this, shove all the pawns on the queen side of the board. It's completely your choice, but over here we can say that white has not really achieved anything in the opening, and this is not the typical position a London system player wants to play. This is completely different, and even someone who plays the Jobava London doesn't really have a lot of experience with this pawn on c3, and I don't really think that their experience in the London systems will be able to help them here. So that was another thing. Although there is one side note that I should mention, although queen f6 is what I recommend, and it's also one of the best moves, there is this immediate sacrifice on e3. And now it's not as good as the previous one where the queen was all on c1, because the queen is not on c1, it's on c2, and then it could be that white is closer to castling or the rook joining for the defense. So knight e3 is a sacrifice also. I wouldn't recommend it in like longer time controls, because with precise play white can equalize, but in shorter time controls it might well be the more practical choice. So after knight e3, well, it makes sense to take. What else are you gonna do? After queen e3, king d1 and castle, we see that the queen here actually prevents the king from coming out. So I don't really think we should give it a green color. Probably more yellowish would be slightly better. And after something, let's say like queen f5, king b8, queen c2, we want to use, the white basically gave this queen check so it could use the c2 square now for the king. And now we play d4. And d4 is very menacing. I think I already showed this idea in one of the previous lines. We want to open up the d file for the rook. and now we are threatening things like d3. But here was the reason why I said white with precise play can equalize. They can play knight c4, which takes the pawn but also counterattacks our own queen. After d3 check, bishop d3, queen d3, knight d3, and rook a d1. They're not really threatened about this check because they can actually exchange with tempo. So something like knight f4, takes, knight e3, they protect the pawn, and then this position is quite equal. They might just play g3 next, kick the knight out. Sorry, they might just play g3 next and kick the knight out, and that should be enough for equality. So that's the reason why instead of knight e3 straight away, I recommend that we play queen to f6. And if you study this position in detail, I don't really think that white player will be finding themselves in a comfortable position. So if you got some value from that, consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and you also get to be notified about the future uploads that I do. And while you're at it, have a look at these other two videos, which I think you might find really interesting. Until next time,